So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Rachel Rudolph. I'm the Extension Vegetable Specialist at the University of Kentucky. And tonight we're going to talk about high tunnel tomato production. Just so we're all on the same page, I'm just going to quickly outline what we'll talk about tonight: soil fertility management, cultivars, production recommendations, and a few tips for preparing for spraying, planting production, and some post-harvest considerations. So just so we're all clear, this is going to be, we're going to focus on, or at least my side is going to focus on in-soil tomato production. So not potting soil, not soilless production, but in soil, specifically in high tunnels, which from the standpoint that I'm going to talk about tonight are passively heated and ventilated covered structures used to protect in-ground crops from sun, wind, excessive rainfall, and or cold. So of course, many of you know that you can add electricity and heat and fans and stuff. We're not going to get into all that tonight. And certainly you can convert your high tunnel into more of a greenhouse, and you can start growing in pots rather than soil. But the focus of tonight's talk will be about growing in soil, growing tomatoes in high tunnels in soil. So some things to keep in mind. So crop nutritional requirements are all the same regardless of conventional or organic production. The source of the nutrients is what changes depending on the production system. So macronutrients, what we call macronutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur, right? Those are the big ones that you'll see on a soil test pretty much regardless, right? They are not more important than the micronutrients. They're just needed in larger quantities, larger rates. Micronutrients would be iron, manganese, copper, zinc, molybdenum, boron, chlorine, and nickel. And you may or may not get those on a soil test, depending on, if you check a certain box wanting to see the rates or the levels of those in your soil. You may see that, you may not. Usually that's an add-on for a lot of soil tests. So nutrient availability. Nutrients may be present in the soil, but not available to the plant. And part of what affects nutrient availability, one of my little quiz questions, the soil pH plays a really important role in determining what nutrients are available to be taken up by plant roots. So you can see here, so a tomato plant's kind of happy zone, can we say, is about 6.5. Usually we say 6.5 to 6.8, somewhere in there, right? And so that's all pretty much green in here. That's our happy place, right? Where things are doing well. But let's say you, over time, right, your soil pH drops and it's now in the 5.5 range. Suddenly, a lot of these macronutrients, a lot of these really important things become not available to your crop, which is a problem, right? They're there in your soil, but they're not available. And then a lot of these other nutrients that are not needed in very large quantities suddenly become very available. And there is such a thing as toxicity. And so nutrient toxicity. And so that is something to be aware of. That's why it's really important to get your pH dialed in. So for example, if soil pH is a 7.5, so over on the alkaline side, certain micronutrients are less available, right? And so that may or may not be an issue depending on what you're growing and what your plant needs. So soil sampling is going to be, should be at the top of your list of where do I start? What do I do, right? So collecting soil samples annually for testing is really, for vegetable growers, that is recommended. So if you come from a farming background, but maybe you were on the agronomic side of crop production, you may not have collected a soil test every year, but definitely for vegetable growers and most certainly for high tunnel growers, an annual soil test is recommended. And I usually ask people, I usually say, collect that soil sample in the fall, submit it in the fall to get prepared for that following spring, right? And so the soil test a routine test is going to include pH, buffer pH, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and zinc. If you go through UK. For high tunnel growers, you should also be requesting a soluble salts test. So when you collect this soil sample and bring it to your county office, you need to make a note of that. Make sure to tell your agent that that's what you want. Ultimately, we'll walk through a little bit of interpreting a soil test. Ultimately, it's about helping you apply only the nutrients needed based on your soil and the crop you intend to grow. It gives it recommendations for, how to apply that fertilizer. And then in addition to soil sampling, you should consider foliar testing for commercial growers. Dialing in the nutrients and the uptake in your plant can be really crucial to getting optimal yield. And ultimately, this helps you save money by not applying things you don't need and keeping things really dialed in. So the fertility guidelines for a tomato crop. So when you get that soil test report back, or when you're looking at recommendations, it's usually 30 to 60 pounds per acre of actual phosphorus. For potassium, it's 200 to 300 pounds per acre. No yield increase has been shown by having more than 60 pounds per acre of phosphorus. So I hear a lot of people apply a complete fertilizer, so something with NPK, when they definitely have more than enough phosphorus, right? That's not helping. That's not a good use of money, and it can complicate things further down the road by adding nutrients that aren't needed. And in a high tunnel, whatever you apply in a high tunnel, if it doesn't get taken up by the crop, it's going to sit there. And that can really complicate things. It's different than in a field where things unfortunately may get leached away, right? And you think, oh, that's a bad thing, but it can really cause nutrient imbalances. So recommendations for magnesium, that's 200 pounds per acre. You really do not need more than that. Again, as I said, pH is 6.5 to 6.8. And when you want to raise the pH, that's applying lime, and you need to be doing that about 6 months before planting to actually hit your mark on what pH you're trying to reach, right? And so that's another reason why it's so important to collect a soil sample well before you intend to plant. And to lower the pH, you need to apply sulfur. Really, it takes about a year to take full effect. That sulfur needs to get converted into sulfuric acid to actually drive the pH down. So that is a soil process, and that takes time. It's not immediately upon applying, oh, I've lowered my pH or I've raised my pH, right? It takes time. So the CEC in Kentucky soils typically range from about 6.6 to 15. Sandy soils could have something a little lower, 5, in the range of 5. Soil organic matter will likely have a CEC greater than 10. So if you've been applying a lot of compost, or you've been cover cropping a lot and incorporating, and you have a high organic matter content, that's something to keep in mind. As a result, though, water moving through the soil profile will leach negatively charged nutrients. So if you have a high CEC, right, let's say it's from a lot of organic matter, a lot of those negatively charged nutrients will move through the root zone. So this can result in a contamination of groundwater, streams, and lakes. But in a high tunnel, right, we're not leaching. It's actually quite hard to leach a lot of things. And so this is less of a concern in a high tunnel than it would be in the open field. Excess fertilizer can become a contaminant and can have adverse effects, though, on human health once it gets into the water source, right, into our groundwater, into our streams and lakes. So recommendations for nitrogen, if you're looking at it from a conventional production side, so you're using synthetic fertilizers, for example, you'd be applying about 50 pounds per acre of nitrogen before planting. So this is actual nitrogen, not fertilizer, not a 50-pound bag of fertilizer. You're looking at 50 pounds of actual fertilizer per acre. So that's the rate. Applying 30 to 50 pounds per acre of nitrogen at fruit set, or split up into weekly applications. So prior to planting, 50 pounds per acre of nitrogen. After planting, 30 to 50 is typically what we recommend. So typically when we talk to vegetable growers, we're recommending calcium nitrate or potassium nitrate, and you can certainly rotate the two, one week, one the next. Weekly fertigation is a great way to apply this. So you can start about 2 weeks after transplanting, and it works out to be 7.5 pounds of nitrogen per week per acre, which works out to be about a half a pound of nitrogen per week in a 30 by 96 foot high tunnel. So adding organic matter can moderate pH and add nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, right? So a lot of growers said, well, I added this, and then I also added a lot of compost. Knowing how much you've applied and where you got it and what the nutrient content of that compost is really beneficial, and we'll talk about that in a second. So recommendations for organic production. So again, nitrogen is the same. The requirement from the plant standpoint is the same. It's how are you putting it down and where is it coming from, right? So a lot of the nitrogen sources for organic producers are a slow release, not immediately available nitrogen like in calcium nitrate or potassium nitrate. So you'd probably want to apply a lot pre-plant, more pre-plant than you would for conventional production. So applying about 100 pounds per acre of nitrogen before planting, and then 30 to 50 pounds per acre of nitrogen at fruit set, or split up into weekly applications. So for organic producers, you can do fish emulsion. You need to dilute it so it doesn't clog your emitters. You could also do a sodium nitrate. Just keep in mind that not look for this OMRI certified. You can go on www.omri.org to check for any restrictions. So for example, sodium nitrate, there are restrictions on how much sodium nitrate you can use as an organic producer. So if you're doing weekly fertigation, again, it's pretty much the same. You could probably hold off a little bit longer on this, not maybe 2 weeks after transplant, maybe 3 or 4, but you'd want to jump in and start fertigating as if you can. So here's a little bit more information on this OMRI Organic Materials Review Institute. So you can look up products. It's really handy, and see if they're allowed or permitted for organic production. Most products have the label, like it says OMRI certified, but you should still go on and read and check with your certifier, whoever's certifying you, or if you're converting to organic production, right? It's really important to get it right. Some products may be allowed, but with restrictions. So you'll see, right? So sodium nitrate status allowed with restrictions, and then you need to go in and read further on what those restrictions are. So in the case of sodium nitrate, it's only a certain amount of it can be used over the course of a season, that kind of thing. So how to calculate the fertilizer needed. So I'm talking in, pounds per acre, right? But we're not dealing in acres if we're dealing with a high tunnel. We're dealing with a much smaller size. So the formula listed on the bag gives the percent, right, by weight of the major nutrients in the bag. So for calcium nitrate, it's a 15.500, right? You can kind of see that there in that corner there. There's the calcium nitrate. So that's 15.5% of nitrogen, 0% phosphorus, 0% potassium. So of that 50-pound bag, 7.7 pounds of it is actually nitrogen. 7.7 pounds of nitrogen are contained in that bag, right? And you can do that math by moving the decimal place over and multiplying that out by the weight of your bag. So for a 30 by 96 foot tunnel, right? So let's find out what that is. So it's not quite 3,000 square feet, right? So 2880. That works out to be about 0.07 of an acre, right? So if you need 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre pre-plant, let's say you're going to use calcium nitrate, you divide that 50-pound rate, 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre, by the amount of nitrogen in your bag, the rate, right? And that gives you a pound of pounds per acre of that calcium nitrate. So 322 pounds per acre of calcium nitrate. If you were applying it to a full acre, that is how much you would apply. But you're not. So multiply your total per acre by your desired area. So you've got 322 pounds per acre times your little acreage here, your high tunnel, right? Multiply that out and you get 21.3 pounds of calcium nitrate for a 30 by 96 foot tunnel. So keep in mind that would be a broadcast application on the entirety of the inside of your tunnel. So if you're one of those people that maintains rows pretty much consistently, then you should not apply it to the entirety of your tunnel, right? You should take measurements and see how wide your rows are, wide and long, right? And do the math that way. So it's going to be even less than this. So, okay, what about the opposite, right? How do you calculate the fertilizer needed? Or if you have let's say if you're an organic producer and you have a smaller amount, right? So pretty much the similar strategy, right? You're just you take this different rate and multiply it out. And so a lot, 27.5 pounds of feather meal for a 30. Again, that is the entirety of the tunnel. So we get a lot of people asking about manure and compost, and growers will say, well, I put a ton of compost down or something like that. Literally, they mean a ton. That's not helpful. A lot of times we need to know, the kind of, if you can at least tell us what the source was, that'll maybe give me an idea of what you put down. You can also have it tested, which I recommend. So this right here, this is from UK. You can get your manure and compost tested, and there it gives you the rate. And so if I know this, and I know exactly how much you put down in a certain area, then, we can figure out, okay, you put down this much nitrogen and you put down this much phosphorus and you put down this much potassium. You see here though, that as far as compost goes, there's a lot less nitrogen than there is of the other two nutrients. So that's not the best source of nitrogen. So here is an example soil test. So phosphorus 277, if you recall, 30 to 60 pounds per acre is the recommendation. So we're at very high. Potassium is right on target, right? So you'd want to put a little bit down just to maintain your status. And, again, this is 70 pounds per acre of potash, not, so it'd be a lot less for a high tunnel. And then paying attention to this soil pH, 5.9, that's, that's too low. And so, hopefully this person collected this in the fall and they can make adjustments. It's also really helpful if you put the crop to be grown, put something in there so that when your agent or myself looks at this, we know that that'll also change the recommendations that the report spits out from Reg Services, but it'll also help me know, right, that this is, I may change things a little bit and make slightly different recommendations. It's also really helpful to tell your agent this report came from a high tunnel. So currently we don't have a way of marking that on the soil test. Hopefully that will change soon. But if you tell them this is in soil in a high tunnel, that will also affect the recommendations you get. So the other thing that it's important to put tomatoes is that you will get this Hartz ratio. So it is specifically for tomatoes. If tomatoes is put in that crops to be grown slot there, you will get a Hartz ratio. It indicates whether the tomatoes will be at risk for ripening disorders such as yellow shoulder, blotchy ripening, white core, that kind of thing. And it's usually caused by low potassium or low potassium in relation to magnesium. So a lot of times I'll see people with really sky high potassium, but their magnesium is so much higher that it throws off the ratio. And you can see here this ratio, potassium to magnesium, right? So if you have really high magnesium, it of course is going to throw this ratio off. So this person put in tomatoes and they got a Hart's ratio 0.45, right? And then it gets this little blurb here. If the ratio is less than 0.35, there is a greater chance that tomatoes will have ripening disorders such as yellow shoulder or blotchy ripening. So, you know, if after the fact, let's say you changed your mind and you didn't put tomatoes in here, but you do plan to plant tomatoes in this high tunnel, that's okay. I can help you calculate that. And chances are I can look at the soil test and tell you whether you're going to have a problem. So, and really it's about looking at your potassium in relation to your magnesium. So nutrient deficiencies, right? Deficient in, of course, most people know that one, right? Yellowing of the entire plant, low vegetative growth. You can also see sun scald on the fruit because the leaves aren't there to protect the fruit from the sun. This purpling of the leaves is from deficient phosphorus. Deficient potassium is usually yellowing of the edges of the leaves. It usually starts in the older leaves. Also uneven ripening in tomato, that yellow shoulder, for example. Deficient magnesium is interveinal chlorosis. So this yellowing between the veins of the lower leaves. So yes, excess nutrients are a thing and they can be a problem, right? So excessive nitrogen can cause too much vegetative growth. So that would lead to either less fruit production or smaller fruit production or smaller root production if you're growing something other than tomatoes. Disease or insect pest pressure, that's a lot to do with that extra vegetative growth, higher humidity, you know, plants are touching each other. And so it's just a lot easier to spread a lot of diseases. Also, poor fruit quality can be a side effect of too much nitrogen. So white core, if you cut a tomato open and you get that really just kind of bland, not very juicy, thick middle, it's white, right? That could be a symptom of that. And blossom drop. So you know, instead of the blossoms leading to fruit, they fall off. Excessive phosphorus can cause increase in chlorosis in plants and can also reduce the plant's ability to take up other nutrients. Excessive salt can cause the burning on the leaf margins and just overall lower yield. And that one thing that I noticed with a lot of people is if they're not tracking their yield over time, they maybe don't notice that they have less yield than they did 5 years ago. So it's really important to keep track of your yield, take notes, compare your notes from last season, that kind of thing, so you can keep track of things. Excessive magnesium can cause reduced uptake of potassium, as I mentioned, and that uneven ripening. So you can see that here. So other ripening disorder, you know, ripening disorders in general are non-pathogenic. They're not caused by an organism. Dr. Goche will address the bacteria, fungi, and Dr. Besson will address the insect pests. So we call them, another word for them are abiotic or physiological disorders. They're not infectious, and it's usually a plant response to an environmental condition. So heat, too much moisture, poor pollination, nutrient or soil pH imbalance, and a lot of the exact causes of a lot of disorders are not well understood, or it's a combination of things. So it's sometimes really hard to pin down what exactly is the cause. So blossom end rot is characterized by dark brown or black sunken area on the bottom end of the fruit, right? Like almost everybody knows this. It's a very disappointing time in the season when you start seeing this, right? The lesions are the result of lack of calcium in the blossom end of the fruit. And so usually people's approach to that is to, okay, I need to put down more calcium. I think I have seen a lot of soil samples since I've been here, and I have never, I think, ever seen a deficient, a soil sample that was deficient in calcium in Kentucky, right? Our soil has plenty of calcium in it. It is about managing that calcium and getting the calcium to the part of the plant that you need it to get to. So it's usually related to water stress, and it usually happens when irrigation is not consistent or not enough, right? So the plant does not have enough water to transport the calcium to the fruit and the blossom end, right? And that's what happens. So calcium moves through water conducting tissues. And so without proper water management, it cannot be transported into those tissues. So extreme temperatures can cause this water stress. So maybe you've got your stuff on a timer and you thought you were doing well. If temperatures spike, right, that can cause it. And that's where you may want to consider shade cloth if it gets really hot and the blossom end rot becomes very unmanageable, right? Calcium is a positively charged ion. So other cations can compete with it. So anything else that's positively charged can also compete for uptake. So again, magnesium can be a problem, potassium, and high soluble salt content in soil can also cause reduced uptake of calcium. And so you would see this again more commonly in high tunnels than open field. So conduct annual soil testing. Avoid soil moisture fluctuations. So really be consistent and regular. Don't let the soil dry out before deciding to water again, right? Really keep track of things. And we'll talk about irrigation a little bit in just a few more slides. And then good soil drainage. So consider planting on raised beds. Tomatoes typically perform better in looser, lighter soils. And again, consider using shade cloth if the high tunnel is is consistently over 86 degrees Fahrenheit, which it honestly can be that way. So mulching can help prevent temperature fluctuations, prevent weeds that may compete for water and nutrients. Again, avoiding that soluble salts and avoiding these high rates of potassium and magnesium. The other really common nutrient deficiency that we see in high tunnels is yellow shoulder. So permanently discolored, yellow patches or green patches on the shoulders on the top end of this fruit, right? It looks unripe, but it never ripens, basically, is what it looks like. So it can be caused by heat injury or insufficient K. Most of the time with high tunnels, once I look at a soil sample or a soil test, I usually end up attributing it to insufficient calcium or potassium. So again, as I said, you may have plenty of potassium in the soil, but it's just not being taken up by the plant. And that is an issue with your Hart's ratio, the magnesium. So conducting a soil test, keeping track of this, really paying attention to that Hart's ratio, keep plants as cool as possible during the high temperatures, orient rows for the best circulation, run fans if you need to, consistent irrigation, and make sure you're following those recommendations. So soluble salts is a test measures the electrical conductivity of a soil water paste. The electrical conductivity of a soil is a representation of the amount of dissolved salts from the soil. So when I say salts, I'm not speaking specifically of sodium. There are a lot of other salts. And so magnesium, potassium, calcium, nitrates, chloride, sulfate, those are also salts. You can also have your natural soil minerals that are in your soil can also be salts. So keep that in mind. It may not be necessarily your fault. It's not all your fault. It could be your soil. Because high tunnels are typically covered with plastic throughout the year, rain is not able to affect the soil as it does in the open environment. So those nutrients and salts build up near the soil surface or the crop root zone. So here's an idea of what you're looking at, EC reading and what's high and what's low, right, for vegetables. So this would be a different table for, a grain crop, for example. So salinity prevention would be, limiting your compost and manure applications, limiting your nitrate applications, applying those things judiciously, right, as needed. So again, that's fertigation. That's why it's another good reason to do the weekly fertigation if you can. Only apply the nutrients needed for the crop. And cover cropping is an option. So cover cropping adds that organic matter that people really like from the compost. That's why they add a lot of compost, is they really want organic matter, but it also scavenges excess nutrients. So overhead, if you already have a salinity issue, right, then we're talking about remediation, not prevention. And overhead irrigation, when crops are not growing, will take a considerable amount of water. But it is possible, right? And so you can see from this table, right, you can leach about 80% of salts below 12 inches. So pretty much below your tomato root zone, right? You need a water volume of 12 inches, which is a heck of a lot of water. So when changing plastic layers, the alternative would be to allow the rain on that high tunnel for a few months. So don't just immediately take the plastic off and replace it, right? Leave it off during the winter and let things leach. Cover cropping, again, is also an option to take up that extra nutrients. So some quick, of course, rotation. I know that's hard for a lot of people, and it's hard for people to do if they have only one tunnel, right? And they're trying to get the most out of their tunnel, but keep that in mind, that without rotation, it's only a matter of time before you start having issues. And so tomato is related to all the other solanaceous crops, peppers and eggplant, right? So rotate away from those things if you can. Usually for Central Kentucky, our transplant date is late March, early April. That's maybe a slightly riskier date. That's usually what I shoot for with my program. But we always have row cover on hand. So if you don't want to do row cover and you don't want to deal with that, then it would be more of a mid-April planting date for high tunnel growers. And as you know, right, the weather has been nuts, and I think it's going to continue to be nuts. So you never know what we're going to have. You know, it could be 80 degrees in March. You never know, or it could be 0 degrees in March. So it's been interesting since I've been here, and I suspect it's going to continue to be that way. So transplant, you want to keep the transplant date really does depend on air and soil temperature. Optimal is 65 to 85 for air temperature, and the minimum really for growth and development is 65 degrees. So we have determinate versus indeterminate tomatoes. So determinate, when we talk, most of what we grow in high tunnels, but not all, are determinates. Certainly there is a lot of room for indeterminate, but most of what I have observed in Kentucky is determinate production. So those determinants, when I say that, those are short, bushier plants, or they are going to stop growing after a certain point. So they'll get to be 4 feet, maybe 5 at the most, and they will stop growing. There's typically less pruning involved, less suckering involved. There's usually a concentrated harvest period, and they're going to be trellised and harvested over a shorter period of time. And that harvesting is going to require a lot of kneeling and searching and kind of, this action. Indeterminate are vining. They're going to be taller and vining, and they do not have, what that means is they are just going to continue to grow, right? So they're indeterminate growth. So you will need to continue to prune, continue to sucker. It's going to have an extended harvest period. So the labor is going to be ongoing. The trellising is going to be ongoing, the clipping, the harvesting, everything. But it does, that open canopy is going to make harvesting easier eventually, right? So it's growing and you can keep harvesting from here versus all the way down on the ground or close to the ground, right? So Fertility is similar between the two, but because of the concentrated fruit maturation and ripening, certain deficiencies can be more common in the determinate cultivars. And the indeterminate cultivars may require more evenly spaced nitrogen applications. So if you're doing indeterminate, that's even more of a reason to do fertigation if at all possible. So that weekly fertigation. Over pruning can cause this leaf roll here that you see. It's a physiological disorder. It's usually not a big deal as far as like from a yield standpoint, but it can affect, photosynthesis, and it can stress the plant. And so just be cautious when pruning. There are high yielding cultivars in both categories. Total yield will depend on management and cultivar choice. I get that question a lot, but which cultivar should I have? And we'll talk a little bit about that, but not much. And then as far as cherry tomatoes go, so most cherry cultivars are indeterminate, but not all. There are a few bush types. They can be harvested for a very long period of time, even into the fall. My observation is that they seem to be a little bit more, like the mature plant seems to be a little bit more cold hardy. So we still had cherry tomatoes, pretty late into the fall this year in Lexington, and they seem to be doing pretty well. The cherries are also less prone to blossom end rot and yellow shoulder. That's less of an issue. But the high labor requirement is, a serious consideration. And if anyone talked to my students who did the majority of the harvesting, they would echo that. But customers love cherry tomatoes because they're ready to eat and they're easy to prep. So if you're thinking about doing the farm to school program, something like that, school lunch programs love cherry tomatoes because they are immediately ready to put out there. Restaurants also love cherry tomatoes for that very reason. So from a salad prep standpoint, right, it's obviously very easy. So I'm not going to spend too much time on these, but this is being recorded and this PowerPoint's available. But here's some that have done well in high tunnels. BHN 589 is usually one of my go-tos as far as a determinate choice in a high tunnel. It does really well for us in Lexington. Carolina Gold is a great orange yellow fruit option. There's a BHN equivalent that slips my mind, but it looks very similar to Carolina Gold and performs also very well. As far as indeterminates go, Marbone is a really beautiful heirloom hybrid, and it's similar sized fruit, but does require quite a bit of daylight. Geronimo, an indeterminate hybrid, and then a couple of indeterminate cherry options that are really tasty. But again, there are there's constantly new varieties being introduced. I would say if you're trying something new, maybe don't plant the whole tunnel with it. Try a few plants, see how you like them, see how your customers like them, that kind of thing. Flavor is also really important and what your customers want. So keep that in mind. So from a plant spacing standpoint, keep in mind that, a lot of people really try to cram stuff in. Humidity, insects, diseases may be an issue with that closer spacing. So fertigation recommendations are based off of an 18-inch in-row spacing and roughly 6-foot centers. Usually people have much closer rows in a tunnel than 6 feet. Normally it's like maybe 4, right? And so just keep that in mind when you're talking about the total plants, right? And how much nitrogen you need to apply. So if you're 18-inch, 4-foot centers, it's about 1.5 times closer. And so you might need about 1.5 times the nitrogen. Tomatoes really are one of those crops that need regular, consistent irrigation. Drip irrigation is the only irrigation recommended. Overhead irrigation is inefficient with water use, leads to disease pressure, and defeats the purpose of having a high tunnel, really. So only one drip line per row of tomatoes is sufficient, that's fine. You can choose the drip tape that's 8 or 12 emitter spacing, that's great. If you're interested in the rain-fed irrigation or low pressure irrigation, I encourage you to check out this YouTube video that Brent Rowell, who is a retired professor from UK, and I did last year. And so I really like this woven weed mat, and myself and a lot of other growers do the same thing. They put the irrigation under the weed mat and, just make sure it's nearby, right? You can see it here in this hole. And it's just, from a weed management standpoint, it's great. And it also, you can still get to the irrigation if you have a hole, that kind of thing. Here is a way to monitor your soil moisture. This is just a sensor, and then this lights up if you're good, and then these lights go back down if you're low on water. And I think this is available from Martin's. It's also available online. So that's an option. So trellising, tomato plants should be staked or trellised so they're off the ground. So begin trellising when plants are about at least 1 foot tall, right? So you can see we had not pruned very well at this point, but things were trellised. Make sure the system you use is strong enough to hold your plants. So if you're one of those that wants to run twine from the top of the tunnel down, right, make sure it can hold the weight of your plants. Make sure your tunnel is okay to do that, and that you have the right twine to hold that. There are a ton of ways you can trellis and support tomato plants. Everybody's options are, preferences are different. And so it may be trial and error if you're new to that, or checking out what your neighbor does, that kind of thing. So indeterminate plants can be trellised from an overhead wire or cable. So you can see here something like this. You can run twine along down the plant, right, like here, and clip it like this as it grows. And so this allows it to keep upright and allows for really tall growth. Of course, Florida weave is a great option. We do that with our determinate varieties, and there's a YouTube video on that. There's also plenty of diagrams online. This is from ID 36, but this it's very simple. It keeps things contained. We use a lot of kind of an, let's see, for the photo, we use pretty much a combination of T-posts and rebar when we, for our posts for trellising and weaving. As far as pruning and suckering, you want to help improve fruit set and help balance vegetative growth with reproductive growth. So the plant's energy goes towards fruit production. So removing leaves at 6 to 12 inches from the ground, right? And then suckering should be done while plants are smaller. So because they're easier to remove, right? And when the suckers are really small, and you're also wasting less of the plant's energy on, putting energy towards the sucker that is just going to be removed. And then there's less chance of creating that open wound that could then lead to infections from a pathogen. So use clippers, don't just break them off. So here's an example of when you should. You want to pull it there, not this. Don't let it get this big, right? So pinching suckers more frequently for indeterminates will prevent plants from getting too heavy and becoming unmanageable. And you can prune indeterminates into basically a 2-stemmed plant and just pinch suckers off as they develop, and you'd still remove all the suckers up to the one right below the first flower cluster. So that approach is similar to a determinate type. Temperatures for a tomato crop, seeding is in the 65 to 70 range. Plants, until plants are transplanted, 60 to 65. And of course, we push those boundaries all the time with high tunnels, but you should have row cover if you're really wanting to push that. And then during flowering and fruiting, right, you really want the big important thing, right, is staying below about 86 degrees. That can really affect flowering and fruiting if it gets really hot. Plan to harvest at least twice a week. A lot of people could harvest probably 3 times and still stay busy. Shallow bins are better. So something like I often see people harvest into a big 5-gallon bucket. That's not great. You don't want to stack things and squish them. Bins with holes for ventilation are good. And don't put when you're harvesting, don't put the bins directly on soil. So then when you stack them on each other, then soil gets again on the fruit, right? So just keep a few things in mind. You don't necessarily need to harvest to wait to harvest every tomato at perfect ripeness. From a just logistics standpoint, that's really hard to do. And they do store longer if they're slightly less ripe when you pick them. However, typically harvesting ripe fruit means better flavor and higher nutrient content. So there is a little trade-off there. So here's just a quick classification. So, a lot of times you might want to harvest them in this pink to light red stage, especially if you don't have market for, another 2 days or something, and you really need to harvest, get some work done, right? Then I think that's reasonable to, not pick them at perfect ripeness every time. But you definitely want them to get ripe enough that, they look good to sell, right? So harvest fruit when pink, during periods when the average temperature is above 70 degrees. If temps are higher, harvest fruit just as they're turning color and keep them at 68 degrees Fahrenheit to color up. That's an option. Fruit will be firmer and have better flavor a lot of times than those ripened on the vine. That's, I hear the kind of both sides, but that's when temperatures are high. So if it's really hot out and you pick that perfectly ripe thing, it may not store very well, and it's kind of going to be gross by the time it gets to the customer. So fruit exposed to direct sunlight can reach about 20 degrees higher than that of shaded fruit. So again, it's really good to balance that vegetative growth with the fruit development. For post-harvest, every minute counts. So quickly removing stuff after harvesting, get it into storage as soon as possible. Don't let it sit out in the sun. Green, mature, fully formed green fruit, 50 to 55 is the temperature, and firm, ripe, fully red, 46 to 50. So tomatoes are sensitive to chilling below 50 if they're held for an extended period of time. So, or at 41 for just, a few days. So keep that in mind, really dial in if you've got a cold storage, really make sure that that is set appropriately. And chilling injury symptoms include, failure to fully ripen, if you've harvested it a little early, develop full color and flavor, blotchy color development, premature softening, surface pitting, browning of seeds, and increased decay. So, here's just some things, right? Keeping a thermometer and a cool bot. I'm not going to go into all that tonight, but keeping that in mind is really good. So you can keep track of things, right? The cool bot has a thermostat on it, keeping a thermometer to keep track of things. Ventilation is crucial for tunnels. So for tomatoes, you want to open them up at night if temperatures are above 50 degrees. You'll likely need to open up a tunnel at least a little bit. If it's a cold but sunny day, it could easily be, 75 degrees in there on a sunny, cold day. So maybe just crack it open, get some airflow, that kind of thing. You don't want to freeze your plants out. Really make sure to keep row cover handy if you are going to try to plant early in the spring. You need to have that row cover before you've even planted. Don't count on being able to order it later. Uncover plants on the sunny days. So again, if you've got to open up the tunnel to keep things cool, then you definitely need to remove that row cover too. Harden plants off before you transplant. Definitely consider shade cloth if you've continued to have blossom end rot problems and you've dialed in that irrigation, then maybe you need to step it up with the shade cloth. And then of course you should not be dealing with weeds in a high tunnel, not really. So really think about your approach to that, either plastic mulch or weed mat, something like that. is really important. And here's just some resources. We've got several YouTube videos that could be helpful. ID36 is great, it is not specific to high tunnels, but there's still a lot of really useful information. A scouting guide for high tunnels that perhaps Dr. Gauthier or Dr. Besson will be talking about later. And then the Vegetable Crops Extension and Research website, that's events, resources, all that kind of stuff.